It's quite a feat to make King George III the natural villain in any American Revolution story, sympathetic and interesting, but Hamilton does it. He's funny, and most people are inclined to soften their view of someone who makes them laugh. Then, too, he's got problems, poor guy. He gives us a peek into his experience, and even though it's hard to hear from him, he speaks truth. What comes next? You've been freed. Do you know how hard it is to lead? Do you have a clue what happens now? The truth is exactly what must be on the victors' minds right now, that they have to turn revolutionary dreams into an actual working government. The Continental Congress was overseeing a new country that was fairly desperately in debt at that point. As Hamilton noted back in Stay Alive, local merchants don't deny us equipment assistance. They only take British money, so sing a song of sixpence. The war debt had the country flat broke, some states more than others, so there's tension also among them that has to be dealt with. The Constitution has yet to be drafted. There are no rules. Throughout history, revolution is often met by counter-revolution, or just never settles down into sober, boring business of governance. The words Miranda puts in King George's mouth drip with schadenfreude and sour grapes, but that doesn't make them incorrect. King George agrees with George Washington agrees with him. A few songs later, when Hamilton's fine theories come up against real politic. Winning was easy, young man, governing's harder. Cabinet Battle #1. The king's problems are laid out in the intro. They say, the price of my war is not a price they are willing to pay. Insane. You cheat with the French, now I'm fighting with the French and Spain. I'm so blue, I thought we'd made an arrangement when you went away. Poor George. He's stuck in the past, looking back nostalgically at almost 200-year-old arrangement. But he is in a world of trouble now that both Spain and France have been riled up against him. Jonathan Groff hits a tone on I'm So Blue that makes us want to hand him a hanky and pat his shoulder. He's so bewildered by his turn of fortune. It doesn't last. In the next line, you were mine to subdue, he says. He sounds aggrieved, even a bit threatening. Yeah, we'll take that under advisement, douche lord. Sorry, Georgie, the deal is off, and we're glad we left you. But still, the song has let us see the world from his point of view, and that empathy helps us to hear the warning that he delivers. Also, he's been there, right? You know how hard it is to lead. That comes from the depths of bitter experience. And then, what will you, when your people hate you, don't come crawling back to me? It's vengeful and petty. The ditched boyfriend crowing that his ex will get her comeuppance. Like Allie and AJ, he wants their stuff back. But there's also a pang of truth. His people say they hate him. And what U.S. president or member of Congress has not had the same experience, whom we've come to like? And we want our country to be a country instead of sinking into the morass that so many new nations do after throwing off the shackles. As with the preceding Yorktown, it feels a bit miraculous that the leaders of the time did turn to statecraft and create something that might last. Clearly, we have our problems. We had to fight a war 80 years later because we couldn't find any unity without continuing slavery. In a bitter irony, If we'd stayed in the British Empire, the enslaved people on our continent might have been freed in 1833, when England abolished slavery throughout all of its colonies. Some of the dreams, such as women's suffrage, took even longer to become a reality, and some of the accomplishments of the new nation ended up being liabilities. I'm thinking of Hamilton's invention, the Electoral College, which made a lot more sense for those 13 colonies than it makes today for our vastly disparate states. When I hear this song and thinking of us now, I understand a line that appears in all three of the King's songs. Oceans rise, empires fall. The empires are obvious, but why oceans rise? Maybe it's only in his first and third songs, so it can be here and remind us that the rise of the oceans is one of the worst creations of and greatest challenges to these United States. Is King George snickering wherever he is? And America is an empire with all the good and the bad that implies. My favorite line is when Groff, having perched on the pinnacle of British accent, says, "You're on your own." And then he drops into Surfer Dude with, "Awesome, wow." I've tried to analyze how Miranda makes anachronism work for him instead of coming across clunky. I don't know, he just has the ear. Of course, it's possible that it will clunk when Hamilton is produced 20 years from now. Slang is the saying thing that sounds most cutting edge when it's new and ages faster and worse. But I think it will wear well. As slang goes, wow has had a lot of staying power. I'm afraid the rising oceans won't be out of date anytime soon either. So, what does come next? One time, Ann and I were in Washington, D.C. at the National Archives where the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and Bill of Rights are displayed. The original Declaration of Independence, 1776, is on the left. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among those life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That declaration was like a blowtorch that lit up the world. No one had ever said that in such a glorious way, that people have a right to rule themselves. The rich and the poor have equal standing. We forget how stunning it was. The Constitution in the center is now the longest lasting written constitution in the world. The founders rejected the idea of property qualifications for holding office because they wanted no part of a veneration for wealth in the document. Their goal was to preserve equal opportunities by destroying any alliance between government and money. The Bill of Rights may even be more amazing. Constitution shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The First Amendment puts every citizen on the same footing. It makes us a beacon of freedom for the rest of the world. Page Smith writes, "Their ambition was not merely to free themselves from dependence and subordination to the crown, but to inspire people everywhere to create agencies of government and forms of common social life that would offer greater dignity and hope to the exploited and suppressed." Ann and I were following a father and a daughter around the rotunda. We heard the father whisper, "This is the Bill of Rights. It says that every person is free." The little girl stared at that aging, fading document and said, It looks like it's falling apart. To which her father replied, It's been through a lot. Our country has been through a lot. Much of it hard, much of it painful, much of it wonderful. We have been given great blessings and great responsibility. We have done great and terrible things. And King George's challenge is in our ears now. What comes next? Where do you think our nation is in the Jesus story? Just before going overseas for a year, a rich executive calls 3 employees in. I'm giving you the chance to prove yourself, and I'm giving you the money to do it. When I come back, I expect a profit. He gives the first $500K, the second $200K, and the last $100K. The year passes quickly. The first 2 take chances with what they've been given and do well. The owner calls them good and faithful and invites them to dinner. But the third is lazy and selfish. He hoards what he's been given, hiding the money where no one can get to it. What he does not understand is that the money was never his to keep. Throw him into the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This harsh story is a warning to those who think that in merely keeping what we have been given, they have done their duty. The United States is a 5-talent country. We have welcomed tired, poor, huddled masses. We led the world in medical advances and higher education. We made progress in recognizing voting rights. Our country has, in many ways, lived out of the goodness of its core values. We have been blessed and been a blessing. We are a 5-talent nation, but we've also given in to the temptation to act like a 1-talent person, to hoard what we have been given, to hang on to what was never ours to keep, and to choose selfishness and distrust. There are 2 Americas, and they are not on speaking terms. Everything is polarizing. We do not understand each other. We do not speak the same language. We live with mutual incomprehension. People on both sides feel like we would be better off if the other side were gone. We want to vanquish the opposition, which is not going to happen. So we need to do better. Churches struggle with how to respond to political division. When everyone in a church shares exactly the same political view, it's easy to confuse God's hopes with the party platform. We begin to look down on those whose politics are not as enlightened as our own. We are seeing too many examples of politicians claiming to be Christians who talk out of both sides of their mouths when it comes to whatever is expedient for them. Christians get to disagree on political issues. There's no one Christian position on the Electoral College, the retraining the police, tax rates, universal basic incomes, or the Green New Deal. Christians of goodwill have different positions on how best to combat racism, to provide health care, and to reform the prison system. Christians differ on military spending, border security, voter fraud, and mandatory vaccinations. Christians can disagree on how to do what is right, but we have to care more about a moral vision of politics than a partisan one. We have to let God's hopes determine our politics rather than our politics controlling our faith. We have to be partisan to the love of God. God's people cannot look out for our own self-interest. We have to listen to those with whom we disagree. We have to speak with kindness. We may never master the other side's mother tongue, but we can pick up a few phrases to indicate that we are trying. God's people are to love everyone without distinction. We stand against the strong taking advantage of the weak. We challenge the powerful to prove their strength by lifting up those who are hurting. A fellow pastor said this: You have to vote as if your skin is not white. Your parents need medical care. Your spouse is an immigrant. Your land is on fire. Your child is transgender. Your house is flooded. Your sister is a victim of gun violence. Your brother is gay. And your water is unsafe. Because privilege has no place in an election, but empathy does. We can love America for the idea that and the hope that no one is above the law, that everyone is accorded due process, that the government belongs to the people rather than to the reverse, that citizens have a right to assemble and to express their opinions, and that the press is free, and that we can worship as we believe God calls us to worship. As a country, we clearly do not live up to the ideals of our Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and Bill of Rights. So we have to keep pushing towards liberty and justice for all. Government easily falls into the hands of those who favor the haves over the have-nots. This is why the gap between the rich and poor is greater than it's been in 60 years, the worst inequity among Western nations. During this pandemic, many of the rich have gotten much richer, and many of the poor have gotten much poorer. Poverty is destroying families that include two parents who work multiple jobs. They are running hard and they keep falling further behind. The gap between poor Americans and prosperous Americans is widening and hardening. More children are growing up in poverty in our country than in any other industrial nation. Republicans and Democrats argue over who is defending the middle class, but neither seems to care enough about those with the greatest needs. Franklin Roosevelt said, "The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have little." The poverty that persists in the midst of great wealth, the growing gap between the rich and the poor, and the maldistribution and of wealth and opportunity should break our hearts. The maldistribution. Couldn't get that out. Jimmy Carter celebrated his 97th birthday on October 1st. Since he won the Nobel Peace Prize, he has asked many times to identify the greatest threat to peace. It took him several years to come to an unequivocal response, but now he says he is sure that the greatest danger is the growing chasm between the haves and the have-nots, a gap that contributes to oppression, injustice, hunger, disease, and war. Jesus lived with compassion for the poor and the forgotten, the have-nots. God's people live with the same compassion. God wants us to bless America, to make our country more caring. So Christians do not vote with our own pocketbooks, but to help people whose pocketbooks are empty. We raise our voice for those who do not get heard. We work for racial justice, improving schools, protecting the environment, promoting financial security, increasing access to health care, supporting the mentally ill, and providing assistance to the poor. We ask hard questions about our government's policies. Do they represent the common good of society rather than the interest of an elite few? Do they show sensitivity to the spirit of the Golden Rule? Do they refrain from the arrogant assumption that the powerful have the right to ignore the needs of the hurting? Do they widen the gap between rich and poor? God's people know the less fortunate are our siblings. God's people take Christ's example seriously. Bill Moyers writes, "As the poor got poorer, the health care crisis worsened, wealth became more and more concentrated, and our political system was bought out from under us. Prophetic Christianity lost its voice. The religious right drowned everyone else out, and they hijacked Jesus. The very Jesus who stood in Nazareth and proclaimed, "The Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor." The very Jesus who challenged the religious orthodoxy of the day by feeding the hungry on the Sabbath, by offering kindness to the prostitute and hospitality to the outcast, who said that the kingdom of heaven belongs to little children, raised the status of women, and even treated the tax collectors like a child of God. This Jesus has been hijacked and turned into a guardian of privilege instead of a champion of the dispossessed. So let's get Jesus back. The Jesus who inspired a Methodist ship worker named Edwin Rogers to crusade across New England for an 8-hour workday. Let's get back the Jesus who called a young priest named John Ryan to champion child labor laws, unemployment insurance, a minimum wage, and decent housing for the poor. 10 years before the New Deal. The Jesus in whose name Dorothy Day challenged the church to march alongside auto workers in Michigan. The Jesus in whose name E.B. McKinney challenged a Mississippi system that kept sharecroppers in servitude and debt. The Jesus in whose name a Presbyterian minister named Eugene Carson Blake, Ike's pastor, was arrested for protesting racial injustice in Baltimore. The Jesus who led MLK to Memphis to join sanitation workers in their struggle for a decent wage. Care for the hurting is not a partisan issue. God calls us all to become more like Christ by caring for the hurting. God has given us so much. We can take our place as God's people and promise to live as Christ's followers. What comes next is entirely up to all of us. Amen. Depart now in the company of Christ the Creator, and as you go, remember, by the goodness of God you were born into this world. By the grace of God you have been kept all day long, even unto this hour. And by the love of God, fully revealed in the face of Jesus, you are being redeemed. Amen.